One thing that doesn't make sense to me and never has is the people who say, I don't like classics. Now, the reason I don't get this isn't because I'm trying to be a snob, but because classics are all so different. There are classics that are romantic. There are classics that are suspenseful or gothic. There are classics that deal with war, murder, the beauty of everyday life. And so I do believe that no matter your taste, there is one, at least one classic out there that you are going to enjoy. So if you want to start your journey and find a classic to read, these are my recommendations for good places to start. And if after you've listened to my list, there is another book that you think should have been on here, do let me know in the comment section. I do think a really great place to start if you want to get into classics for the very first time is to read classics that were originally written for children. Because they were originally intended for a younger audience, the language is going to be easier to understand even if you haven't read many or any classics before. I just had to start my list with the classic that was my favorite as a child, and that is Little Women by Louisa May Alcott. When I was a little girl, I had an illustrated copy of Little Women that I read so much the spine quite literally fell apart. This classic follows four sisters living in Massachusetts during the Civil War, and it was partially inspired by author Louisa May Alcott's own life with her sisters. Because this was originally written for a younger audience, it is very easy to get into, and I think even if you don't have a lot of experience with classics, you shouldn't have a very hard time following the story. It's a great choice if you love books that center on families and also has a dash of romance and some heartbreaking parts that may or may not make you cry. When I was young, Jo March was one of my all-time favorite fictional characters because she wanted to be an author, and that has been my dream my entire life. So I really related to her as a little girl and actually looked up to her as a sort of role model. She is definitely one of the most iconic characters in classic literature, though honestly, when I reread this as an adult, I did find myself having a new appreciation for Amy that wasn't there before. And no spoilers, but if there's any of you out there who believe that the sisters did not end up marrying the right men, you're wrong. No Professor Bear slander is allowed in my comment section, okay? Other children's classics that I think would be great places to start include Alice's Adventures in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll. I actually read this in college for a class I was taking on children's literature throughout history, and I think this would be a good starting point because the story is very familiar to a lot of people who know the Disney version and other adaptations. And Anne of Green Gables by L.M. Montgomery is, again, a really great children's classic to start your journey. I did not personally read this when I was a child. I only read it for the first time as an adult, but I know so many classic literature girlies who started their love affair with classics because they read Anne of Green Gables when they were a child. This is the first in a series that follows the main character Anne, who is an orphan adopted by a family in Prince Edward Island, Canada. This is going to be a very accessible starting point if you want to read a classic but are intimidated by some of the longer ones. And if you do end up really liking it, then there's a whole series that you could potentially check out. And it also has a strong romantic subplot throughout the series if that's something that you're interested in. Another one of my tips for starting with classics is to find a classic that you're kind of already familiar with, one that really has staying power in popular culture, so even though you haven't read it before, you do know a little bit about the story and the characters. So that's why my next recommendation is going to be The Sherlock Holmes Mysteries by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. The first book in this series is A Study in Scarlet, but honestly, I think the short stories wouldn't be a bad place to start. Reading a Sherlock Holmes story or two could be a great taste test to see if you like this series, and honestly, I actually like the Holmes short stories better than the full-length novels, which is the opposite of how I usually feel about mystery short stories. I think pretty much everybody knows who Sherlock Holmes is. He is the brilliant Victorian-era detective who is great at solving crimes, but maybe not as great at social interactions, and he's assisted by his faithful companion, Dr. Watson. And Dr. Watson is so iconic that people often refer to sidekicks in detective stories as the Watson. Subscribe to my channel if you want to see a future episode of my series Mystery Trope Talk, talking about the Watson figure in detective stories. And since Holmes and Watson are such iconic characters, I think this is a great starting point for people. There have been so many Sherlock Holmes adaptations. Even back in the 1920s, they would adapt it for radio or silent films. These are going to be characters that most people are familiar with, and again, even though these are Victorian era stories, I don't think the writing is dense. I think it's going to be pretty straightforward, even if you haven't read a lot of classic novels. And I definitely recommend starting with Sherlock Holmes if you are someone who enjoys reading a lot of mysteries nowadays, because this series is so influential in the development of mysteries as a genre. And if you know that you like mystery plotlines in your modern day literature, starting with a classic that includes mystery is a great place to start. Now, what if you like a bit of a gothic vibe to your books, or some very beautiful prose? If that's the case, I recommend that you start your classics journey with The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. Again, a really popular, continual favorite throughout the ages. I mean, where do you think we get the saying, "a portrait in the attic" from? This story follows a young man named Dorian Gray who discovers that his portrait can age for him so that he will stay young forever. However, his life of debauchery soon spirals out of control. This book is beautifully written. There are so many sentences in this that are just so well phrased that I had to stop and marvel at the poetry of them. However, at the same time, I don't think it would be that hard to understand if you haven't read that many Victorian era books before. And since it is only 200 something pages, it is not going to be nearly as intimidating as some of those 600 plus page classics. This book does also have queer themes, if that's something that you are interested in. There is a very clear queer subtext in this book that I do believe was more explicit in earlier drafts, but Oscar Wilde had to be a little more subtle about it because during this period in history, being gay was illegal. And Oscar Wilde himself was sentenced to prison and forced to serve out a sentence of hard labor due to his own sexuality. Not only is this book extremely well written, but I think there are things in it that are going to appeal to a lot of different people, whether you're interested in queer themes, gothic vibes, or even a murder. Now, speaking of beautiful writing, let's talk about my penultimate recommendation, which is The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. I feel like most American high school students had to read this book, but if by chance you haven't read it yet, I think it would be a great place to start as a beginner to classic literature. I mean, first of all, look how short it is. This is so short compared to some of the other classics out there, and definitely not as intimidating. It is less than 200 pages, guys. Definitely a good short classic to read. Now, at one point in my life, this was actually my all-time favorite book. It's not anymore, not because I don't still like it, just because I have read a lot more books since then, and so it did get knocked down on my list, but it is still a really good book. There are some lines in this that are just so beautifully written, and it definitely is an iconic work of literature. This book follows a group of wealthy people living in East Egg and West Egg, fictional communities on Long Island that are inspired by the Hamptons. Written during the 1920s, it has all of that classic jazz age glamour, and if you are someone who likes drama, this is the book for you. If you, like me, love those books about a bunch of filthy rich people engaging in scandalous behavior, this is perfect for you. Though I would say if you're the type of reader who needs someone to root for in a book, I don't know if you'll get on with this because really none of the characters are good people, and if you want to attach to one as the moral center, I think you're not going to have a lot of choices. Finally, this book is not only my favorite classic, it is my favorite book of all time. And of course, I'm talking about Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. This book is the love story between Elizabeth Bennet and Mr. Darcy, and it is undoubtedly iconic. It has been adapted many times, and so many modern day authors look to this story for inspiration when writing their romance plots. If you are a contemporary romance reader who is looking to get into a classic, then definitely Jane Austen is someone worth checking out. But people sometimes speak of her book as just romances in a derogatory way, but they actually are much more complicated than that. Obviously, yes, her books do involve strong romantic elements, however, they are also filled with wit and social criticism. Austen's observations about society are so apt. I also think she's genuinely really funny. When I read Jane Austen, there are moments in her books that will actually make me laugh out loud. I don't think people give her enough credit for how witty she actually is. And as a feminist, I do think there are feminist elements to all of Austen's books. Obviously, Jane Austen was not a feminist in the way that we in the 21st century would define a feminist, but for someone living in the 1800s, she did have at the time what were some pretty liberal ideas about women and how they were treated by society. I also think that the characters in Jane Austen's novels are some of the best characters that I've ever read about. There are so many characters in her books who I genuinely love. Elizabeth Bennet was another one of my childhood heroes. I had an illustrated edition of Pride and Prejudice when I was young as well, and Elizabeth Bennet and Jo March were who I wanted to be when I grew up. There's going to be a lot of characters that you'll love and a lot of characters that you'll love to hate as well. All of Jane Austen's novels are amazing, but I am recommending Pride and Prejudice as a great place to start because one, it is where I started with Austen, and two, I also think that this book has the lowest barrier to entry because it is her most famous book. So even if you haven't read Austen before, you're probably going to be at least a little bit familiar with the story of Pride and Prejudice. And if you love an enemies to lovers plot, what are you waiting for? You need to read this book because Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy invented enemies to lovers. This book is my favorite book of all time. I have read it multiple times. I intend to read it many more times before I die, and I can't imagine any other book coming along and beating this one in my heart. If you liked this list, please do give this video a big thumbs up and subscribe to my channel to see more from me. If you think there are some other classic books that I should have had on this list, do let me know your recommendations in the comment section. And if you want another video on where to start with classic literature, why don't you watch this one from a few years ago where I talked about where I recommend that you start with Jane Austen's novels. Thank you so much for watching and have a wonderful rest of your day. I'll see you next time.